The most dangerous prison in the Count of Monte Cristo is not the one everyone remembers. It is not made of stone. It has no walls, no guards, no locked gates. And yet it may be impossible to escape. Because what if the real tragedy of Edmond Dantès is not that he was betrayed? What if the real tragedy is that he could never fully trust again? Most people look at Edmond Dantès and see a revenge story. They see a man who suffered injustice, endured unimaginable hardship, and eventually returned with the power to settle every score. On the surface, that sounds like victory. It sounds like justice. It sounds like the restoration of balance. But there is a question hidden beneath that interpretation. A question that becomes harder to ignore the longer you sit with this story. What if revenge was never the destination? What if revenge was the symptom? Because betrayal does something strange to the human mind. It doesn't simply hurt us. It rewrites the way we see people. It changes the operating system underneath every future relationship. The wound is not limited to the moment itself. It extends forward into the future. And that is where Edmond Dantès becomes far more than a literary character. He becomes a mirror. Not a mirror for people seeking revenge, but for anyone who has ever discovered that trust can disappear in a single moment and take years, or even a lifetime, to return. Think about it. When a stranger lies to you, it hurts. When someone you trust betrays you, something deeper breaks. Because trust is not merely a feeling. Trust is the invisible architecture that allows us to build a future with other people. It is the assumption that friendship means something. That loyalty means something. That promises have weight. Once that architecture collapses, the damage is no longer external. It becomes internal. And here is the paradox that makes Edmond Dantès so fascinating. The stronger he becomes, the more difficult it becomes to know whether he is actually free. Power grows. Control grows. Influence grows. But does trust grow? Or does suspicion quietly take its place? That question transforms this story from a tale of revenge into something much more unsettling. Because history is filled with people who escaped difficult circumstances. Far fewer escaped the worldview those circumstances created. A prison door can open. A wounded identity is harder to unlock. That is why one image lingers long after the details fade. A man walks out of a cell. Yet part of him remains inside. And perhaps that is the mystery hiding at the center of Edmond Dantès. Not whether he can defeat his enemies. Not whether he can reclaim power. But whether the person who emerges from suffering is still the same person who entered it. Because if betrayal can reshape trust, and trust can reshape identity, then the real question is no longer about one man in one story. The real question is something far more uncomfortable. How much of who we become is shaped by the people who loved us? And how much is shaped by the people who betrayed us? Before we ask whether trust can return, we need to confront a more uncomfortable possibility. What if trust is not the first thing betrayal destroys? What if the first casualty is identity itself? Most people think of identity as something stable. We imagine that deep down, there is a permanent version of ourselves that remains unchanged no matter what happens. Different circumstances may affect our mood, our decisions, even our relationships, but the core person stays intact. The story of Edmond Dantès challenges that assumption. Not through what happens to him, but through what happens inside him. Because betrayal creates a unique kind of contradiction. The pain does not come from discovering that evil exists. Everyone already knows that. The pain comes from discovering that the people we trusted most were capable of becoming strangers. And once that realization enters the mind, a new question emerges. If I was wrong about them, what else am I wrong about? Suddenly, the world becomes less predictable, less understandable, less safe. That is why betrayal often produces something deeper than anger. It produces hyper-awareness. A constant search for hidden motives. A relentless need to anticipate danger before danger arrives. At first, this feels like wisdom. But here is the contradiction. The same mechanism that protects us can also isolate us. The same vigilance that prevents future betrayal can slowly make genuine trust impossible. And this is where Edmond Dantès begins to represent something larger than a single character. He becomes the embodiment of a universal temptation. The temptation to replace vulnerability with control. Think about how attractive that trade can be. Trust requires uncertainty. Control promises certainty. Trust requires faith in people. Control requires only faith in yourself. Trust risks disappointment. Control appears to eliminate risk altogether. At least that is the illusion. Because every system built entirely around control carries a hidden cost. The stronger the walls become, the harder it becomes for anyone to enter. A man escapes a cell. His heart remains incarcerated. That image lingers because it reveals a truth many people recognize in their own lives. Some leave toxic friendships, yet carry suspicion into every new friendship. Some survive betrayal in love, yet begin treating future relationships as potential threats rather than possibilities. The original wound ends. Its architecture remains. And here the scale of the story quietly expands. This is no longer just about one individual. It becomes a question about families, communities, institutions, entire societies. Because trust is not merely a personal emotion. It is social infrastructure. Every partnership depends on it. Every friendship depends on it. Every promise depends on it. Remove trust from a society, and power rushes in to fill the vacuum. Remove trust from a relationship, and control often takes its place. Remove trust from an identity, and something even stranger happens. The self begins to reorganize around protection rather than connection. And that may be the hidden transformation at the center of Edmond Dantès. Not the acquisition of power. Not the pursuit of justice. But the gradual construction of a new self designed never to be wounded in the same way again. A mask so effective that it starts replacing the face beneath it. And this leads us toward an even deeper mystery. If betrayal can create a new identity, if survival itself can become a mask, then how do we know where protection ends and transformation begins? At what point does a person stop defending who they were and start becoming someone else entirely? But here is where the story becomes genuinely unsettling. If a wounded person builds a new identity to survive, how do we distinguish healing from adaptation? Because those are not always the same thing. We often assume that survival is proof of recovery. If someone becomes stronger, more capable, more resilient, we instinctively call that growth. We celebrate it. We admire it. We point to the transformation and say, look how much they have overcome. But what if strength can sometimes hide a loss? What if resilience can occasionally become a disguise? This is the contradiction at the center of Edmond Dantès. The more effective he becomes, the harder it becomes to measure what that effectiveness is costing him. And that raises a dangerous question. Can a person become so focused on preventing future betrayal that they accidentally eliminate the very conditions that make trust possible? Because trust requires openness. Protection requires distance. Trust accepts uncertainty. Protection attempts to eliminate it. The two impulses pull in opposite directions. And sooner or later, one begins to dominate the other. This is why the deepest conflict in this story is not between a man and his enemies. It is between two competing visions of human existence. One vision says that vulnerability is necessary. That connection always involves risk. That trust remains valuable even though it can be broken. The other vision says that trust is weakness. That control is safer. That dependence creates exposure. That emotional distance is wisdom. At first glance, the second vision appears stronger, more disciplined, more intelligent, more secure. But appearances can be deceptive. Because a life organized entirely around protection carries a hidden consequence. It slowly transforms every human interaction into a calculation. Every friendship becomes a question mark. Every act of kindness becomes a potential strategy. Every expression of loyalty becomes something to evaluate rather than experience. And this is where the scale of the conflict expands beyond literature. Entire societies have faced the same dilemma. When trust collapses, institutions compensate with surveillance. When communities lose faith in one another, rules multiply. When people stop believing in relationships, they begin believing in systems. Power grows where trust disappears. Control grows where connection weakens. The pattern repeats itself at every level of human life. Individual, family, community, civilization. That repetition is not accidental. It reveals something profound about the nature of trust itself. Trust is invisible when it exists. Its importance only becomes obvious after it is gone. A broken bridge teaches the value of a bridge. A silent room teaches the value of a voice. A shattered promise teaches the value of trust. And perhaps that is why one image continues to linger throughout this story. A mask so successful that it consumes the face beneath it. The mask was never the problem. The mystery is what happens when the person wearing it can no longer remember where the mask ends. Because identities built around pain possess a strange characteristic. They often continue functioning long after the original danger has disappeared. The wound heals. The defenses remain. The threat vanishes. The worldview survives. A man escapes a cell. His heart remains incarcerated. And here the contradiction reaches its most uncomfortable form. What if the greatest victory is also the final trap? What if achieving complete control over one's circumstances does not restore freedom, but merely replaces one kind of imprisonment with another? Because if identity can be rebuilt around injury, if protection can slowly become isolation, if power can grow while trust disappears, then perhaps the central mystery is larger than Edmond Dantès himself. Perhaps the real mystery is whether a person can devote years to becoming someone new, without eventually losing the person they were trying to protect in the first place. Before asking whether a transformed identity can ever return to its original form, we have to confront an even deeper revelation. What if the true function of revenge is not punishment at all? What if revenge is an attempt to restore meaning? This is where the story begins to reveal something far more profound than a conflict between victims and those who wronged them. The deeper struggle is between chaos and order. Betrayal does not simply cause pain. It destroys coherence. It creates a world in which actions no longer seem connected to consequences, loyalty no longer guarantees protection, and fairness no longer appears real. Suddenly, the universe feels unpredictable. And human beings are not designed to live comfortably inside unpredictability. We seek patterns. We seek explanations. We seek reasons why suffering happened. This is the hidden role of Edmond Dantès. Not merely an avenger. Not merely a survivor. He becomes a man attempting to reconstruct a shattered moral universe. The revelation is that revenge offers something that trust cannot. It offers certainty. Trust asks us to believe. Revenge asks us to calculate. Trust requires patience. Revenge creates a plan. Trust leaves room for mystery. Revenge promises control. And that promise is incredibly seductive. Because once betrayal has exposed the fragility of faith, certainty begins to feel like salvation. Yet another contradiction emerges. The more certainty a person demands, the less room remains for humanity. Human beings are complicated. Relationships are imperfect. Forgiveness is uncertain. Growth is unpredictable. But systems of judgment crave clarity. They divide the world into categories: innocent, guilty, ally, enemy, safe, dangerous. What begins as a search for justice can slowly become a reduction of reality itself. This is why one image becomes increasingly important. Not the prison cell. Not the enemy. The mask. A mask is more than concealment. A mask is simplification. It allows a person to become one thing completely. One purpose. One mission. One identity. But every mask hides complexity. Every mask hides contradictions. Every mask hides the parts of ourselves that do not fit the role we have chosen. The deeper insight is that Edmond Dantès is not simply carrying a mask. He is carrying a philosophy. A philosophy that says suffering can be balanced. That wrongs can be corrected. That moral order can be restored through precision and determination. Yet the story quietly invites us to question that assumption. Because what happens when life refuses to fit the categories we create? What happens when people cannot be reduced to symbols? What happens when justice encounters ambiguity? Suddenly the conflict expands beyond one individual. Entire civilizations have struggled with the same temptation. Every era produces people who believe they can permanently solve disorder through control. Every generation creates systems designed to eliminate uncertainty. Yet uncertainty always returns. Complexity always returns. Humanity always returns. The attempt to remove ambiguity often creates new forms of blindness. And this may be the hidden legacy of Edmond Dantès. Not that he demonstrates the power of revenge, but that he exposes the limits of certainty itself. Because beneath every strategy, beneath every calculation, beneath every carefully constructed identity, a deeper question remains unresolved. What if the greatest illusion was never the belief that justice could be achieved? What if the greatest illusion was the belief that a human being could become a judge without also becoming a participant in the very mystery they are trying to solve? And if that is true, then perhaps the most important question is no longer what happened to Edmond Dantès. The real question is whether anyone can take control of fate itself without eventually discovering that fate was transforming them all along. Before we can understand the final meaning of this transformation, we have to ask a question that sits beneath every layer we have explored so far. What was Edmond Dantès truly trying to recover? Most people would answer with obvious things. Freedom. Justice. Dignity. Balance. But the deeper revelation is that none of those are the real center of the story. The true loss was not opportunity. It was innocence. Not innocence in the childish sense, but in the philosophical sense. The ability to move through the world without constantly measuring, calculating, anticipating, and defending. The ability to believe that human relationships could exist without hidden agendas. This is the core revelation many readers never fully confront. The central tragedy is not that betrayal destroyed an innocent man. The tragedy is that betrayal created a man who could never again experience the world in the same way. The transformation itself becomes the consequence. Suddenly, the entire story looks different. The focus shifts away from justice and toward perception. Away from enemies and toward identity. Away from what was taken and toward what could never be restored. Because there are some losses that cannot be measured by wealth, status, power, or success. There are losses measured in ways of seeing. Ways of feeling. Ways of trusting. A child who learns that the world can be dangerous does not simply gain knowledge. That child loses a particular version of reality forever. In the same way, a person who has experienced profound betrayal does not merely acquire wisdom. They often lose access to a form of openness that once felt natural. This is why the mask carries such symbolic weight. It does not merely conceal identity. It represents adaptation itself. Human beings survive by adapting. We build new beliefs, new defenses, new strategies, new versions of ourselves. Yet every adaptation contains a hidden question. What did it cost to become this person? A mask so successful that it consumes the face beneath it. That image is not only about one character. It is about all of us. Every major wound creates pressure to construct a new self. Sometimes that new self is stronger. Sometimes wiser. Sometimes more capable. But strength and wholeness are not the same thing. Wisdom and peace are not the same thing. Capability and freedom are not the same thing. That distinction is the philosophical heart of the story. Because the deepest conflict was never between justice and injustice. It was between two competing definitions of freedom. One definition says freedom means power over circumstances. The other says freedom means remaining fully human despite circumstances. Those two paths occasionally intersect, but they are not identical. And that realization expands far beyond literature. Entire societies face the same dilemma. Nations pursue security and lose openness. Institutions pursue control and lose trust. Individuals pursue protection and lose connection. The pattern repeats because the temptation is universal. We believe that if we can eliminate enough risk, we can finally be free. Yet the story suggests a disturbing possibility. The pursuit of absolute protection may become its own form of captivity. The escaped prisoner who remains emotionally confined is not merely a character. He is a warning. A memory fragment. A symbol. A reflection of a permanent human struggle. And if the greatest loss was never freedom, but innocence itself, then a larger consequence begins to emerge. What happens not only to a person, but to an entire culture, when trust becomes so fragile that protection is valued more highly than connection? Writing, variant equals, document ID equals 715 for 2, : if the deepest loss was a way of seeing the world, then the consequence reaches far beyond a single life. The most important question is no longer what happened during the transformation. The question is what remains after the transformation is complete. Because every major conflict leaves behind a residue. Long after events fade, long after victories and defeats lose their immediate significance, something remains embedded in the person who lived through them. This is the lasting consequence that gives the story its unusual power. The legacy is not found in what was achieved. It is found in what became normal. A worldview once built for survival gradually becomes permanent. A strategy becomes a personality. A defense becomes a philosophy. And eventually, a temporary response to suffering begins to shape an entire life. This is why the story continues to resonate across generations. Most people will never experience the exact circumstances of Edmond Dantès. Yet countless people understand what it means to carry an old wound into a new chapter of life. They understand how a past disappointment can influence future choices. They understand how one betrayal can quietly alter expectations for years. The original event becomes history. The consequence becomes identity. A man escapes a cell. His heart remains incarcerated. That memory fragment survives because it points toward something universal. Human beings rarely remain imprisoned by events. More often, they remain imprisoned by conclusions. Conclusions about trust. Conclusions about love. Conclusions about human nature. Conclusions about themselves. And those conclusions can outlive the circumstances that created them. The scale of the legacy expands even further when we stop looking at individuals and start looking at societies. Communities develop collective memories in the same way people do. A culture that experiences repeated disappointment may become cynical. A nation that experiences repeated instability may become obsessed with control. Institutions that lose trust often compensate with rules. Relationships that lose trust often compensate with distance. The pattern repeats because the underlying mechanism is the same. Protection slowly replaces connection. Certainty slowly replaces openness. The consequence is not always dramatic. Sometimes it appears reasonable. Sometimes it appears intelligent. Sometimes it even appears responsible. Yet over time, something essential begins to disappear. The willingness to believe in possibilities that cannot be guaranteed. This is where the legacy of the story becomes philosophical rather than personal. It forces us to ask whether survival alone is an adequate measure of success. Modern culture often celebrates resilience, strength, independence, and self-protection. Those qualities matter. They can be necessary. But the story leaves us with a lingering doubt. What if a life becomes so focused on avoiding future wounds that it also avoids future connection? What if safety quietly becomes the highest value? What if the price of never being hurt again is never fully trusting again? The enemy loses everything. The victor cannot recover what was lost first. That image contains the enduring consequence of the entire journey. Not because it offers an answer, but because it exposes a paradox. Human beings need protection. Human beings also need trust. The challenge is that those needs often pull in opposite directions. And perhaps that is the unresolved mystery that remains after everything else has been stripped away. If wisdom teaches us how to protect ourselves from suffering, who teaches us how to remain open to life after the suffering is over? Perhaps that is why this story continues to endure long after its historical setting has faded into the distance. Not because it provides a perfect answer to injustice. Not because it offers a flawless model of strength. And not because it resolves every moral tension it introduces. It endures because it understands something unsettling about human nature. It understands that the most important battles are often invisible. The deepest transformations rarely happen in public. And the consequences that shape a life are not always the ones the world can see. When people remember figures like Edmond Dantès, they often focus on what he became. Yet the lasting significance of his journey may lie somewhere else entirely. It may lie in the question of what every human being risks becoming when pain is allowed to define identity. Because identity is never built from events alone. It is built from the meaning we attach to those events. Two people can endure the same hardship and emerge with completely different visions of the world. One becomes more closed. The other becomes more open. One becomes more suspicious. The other becomes more compassionate. The event matters. But the interpretation matters even more. That is why the story feels larger than the individual who stands at its center. It becomes a meditation on the choices hidden inside suffering itself. Not the choice of whether pain arrives. Pain arrives for everyone. The real choice concerns what pain is ultimately allowed to teach us. A prison door opens. Yet trust never returns. A mask becomes so successful that it consumes the face beneath it. The enemy loses everything. The victor cannot recover what was lost first. These images remain powerful because they are not merely symbols within a novel. They are reflections of possibilities that exist within every human life. They remind us that there are forms of loss that cannot be measured. Forms of freedom that cannot be purchased. Forms of captivity that leave no visible chains. And perhaps that is the deepest legacy left behind. The story quietly challenges one of the assumptions that modern culture often celebrates. We are frequently told that becoming stronger is always the goal. That becoming harder is wisdom. That becoming untouchable is freedom. Yet human beings were never meant to be untouchable. To care is to risk disappointment. To trust is to risk betrayal. To love is to risk loss. Remove those risks entirely, and something essential disappears with them. The paradox is that the qualities that make us vulnerable are often the same qualities that make life meaningful. Which brings us to the final insight. The opposite of suffering is not control. The opposite of suffering may be connection. Not perfect certainty. Not absolute safety. Not complete protection. Connection. The willingness to remain human in a world that constantly offers reasons not to. And perhaps that is why the story still feels relevant centuries later. It is not asking whether justice can be achieved. It is asking something far more personal. After disappointment, after betrayal, after the collapse of certainty, what part of ourselves are we willing to preserve? Because in the end, the most important question may not be whether the world has wounded us. The most important question may be whether, in our effort to survive those wounds, we have protected the very thing that made us human in the first place.